Have you ever wondered what happens when a cozy home gets ready for afternoon tea? But the little ones have their own ideas about fun. Today's story will transport us to a beautiful sunlit garden filled with the scent of lavender, where we will learn that love is far more important than perfect clothes, guiding us into a deep, peaceful sleep. Once upon a time, in a beautiful stone cottage nestled deep within the rolling green hills of the English Lake District, there lived a dignified mother cat named Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit. Her home was always filled with the sweet, comforting scent of dried lavender and freshly baked shortbread. Mrs. Tabitha was a very tidy soul who took immense pride in her spotless kitchen and, above all, her 3 beautiful, fluffy kittens. Their names were Moppet, Mittens, and little Tom Kitten. Now, on this particular summer afternoon, Mrs. Tabitha was expecting company for afternoon tea, and everything had to be absolutely perfect. The grandfather clock in the hallway went tick-tock, tick-tock, counting down the moments until the guests arrived. The silver spoons were polished. The finest porcelain cups were arranged neatly on the table, and a fresh pot of blackberry jam sat waiting. The soft white steam rose gently from the stove, dancing in the air like tiny warm clouds. However, before her friends could arrive, Mrs. Tabitha had a rather grand and difficult task to perform. She had to wash, brush, and dress her 3 unruly kittens, so they would look like proper little ladies and gentlemen. First came Moppet and Mittens. Mrs. Tabitha carefully washed their furry little faces, wiping away the tiny smudges of milk. She brushed their soft whiskers until they stood out straight and neat, and combed their fur until it shone like silk. Then she dressed them in their finest Sunday clothes. Moppet was tucked into a beautiful, clean white pinafore that smelled of fresh sunshine, and Mittens received a lovely little frock with tiny, delicate embroidery around the collar. The 2 little sisters looked absolutely delightful, like 2 small, fluffy clouds sitting neatly on the kitchen bench. But then it was Tom's turn. Oh dear, Tom Kitten was quite a different story altogether. Tom was a youthful, clean-shaven, slender kitten with a beautiful coat of curly brown hair. He was full of mischief, always wanting to pounce on passing shadows in the garden. Tom had grown quite a bit over the spring, and he was remarkably fat and broad. In fact, he was so wonderfully plump that his fine blue woolen tunic and smart trousers were far too tight for him. Mrs. Tabitha sighed gently as she struggled to pull the tight, clean, simple tunic over Tom's curly brown head. She pulled and she tugged, trying her absolute best to make the outfit fit. Several of the shiny white buttons burst off across the kitchen floor, rolling away with a cheerful little click. Mrs. Tabitha patiently fetched a needle and blue thread and sewed them back on, pulling the fabric as tight as she dared. The grandfather clock in the hall gave a loud chime. warning them that the tea party was drawing closer. Finally, all 3 kittens were fully dressed. Mrs. Tabitha looked down at them with a mixture of pride and anxiety. In order to keep her beautiful parlour perfectly clean for her guests, she decided to send the kittens out into the garden for a little while. But before she opened the heavy oak door, she gave them a very strict warning. "My dear children," Mrs. Tabitha said, "you must walk on your hind legs, and you must stay on the clean gravel path. Do not go near the dirt. Do not climb the old stone walls. Keep your clothes clean and beautiful until my friends arrive for tea." The kittens nodded obediently, their big round eyes looking up at her with complete innocence. Mrs. Tabitha smiled, kissed their little foreheads, and let them out into the warm, golden afternoon air. As soon as the garden door closed, Moppet and Mittens tried their very best to follow instructions. They stood up on their hind legs and took a few small, wobbly steps along the crunchy gravel path. But walking on 2 legs is a very difficult thing for a little cat to do when the garden is so full of wonderful things. Within just a few moments, Moppet stumbled over a smooth stone and fell right off the path, landing onto the lush green grass. As she scrambled back up, her neat little pinafore caught on a red currant bush, and she left her small hat hanging from a branch. Mittens stopped to look at her sister, and as she did, her own balance slipped. She sat down quite heavily right in the middle of a bed of sweet-smelling thyme. When she stood up, her lovely little frock was covered in green stains. The 2 sisters looked at each other, their elegant clothes already looking rather untidy, and let out a soft, kittenish mew. But where was Tom Kitten? Oh, Tom was having a far more difficult time indeed. Because his clean, simple tunic was so remarkably tight, he found it completely impossible to walk on his hind legs. Every time he tried to stand upright, the tight blue wool pulled against his legs. So, forgetting all about the gravel path, Tom dropped down onto all 4 paws and began to crawl through the flower beds. With every pounce, the tight buttons on his clothes began to feel the strain. Pop! Off went another button, flying through the air and landing silently in the dark soil beneath a large pink peony. Tom felt a wonderful sense of relief as the tight fabric loosened just a little. He crawled further, squeezing his slender body through a small gap in the old stone wall. Crack! The tight trousers caught on a sharp stone and split completely open. Moppet and Mittens came running over to help him, but instead of fixing his clothes, they decided to help him take them off entirely. It was simply much too warm a day to be wearing heavy, tight wool. Together, the 3 kittens rolled in the grass, laughing and mewing happily as they pulled off the tight blue tunic. Tom, now free from his restrictive garments, shook his curly brown hair and let out a long, contented purr. He was finally just a normal, comfortable little kitten again. They gathered the bundle of fine clothes and placed them in a neat little pile on top of the sunny stone wall. Just as they did, they heard the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps coming from the other side of the garden. Tramp, 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 splash, splash. Marching down the road in a perfectly neat single file came 3 large, cheerful ducks. The first duck was a very polite gentleman named Mr. Drake Duck, and behind him walked 2 elegant ladies, Mrs. Rebecca Puddle Duck and her sister. They walked with a grand, dignified waddle, their yellow webbed feet clapping rhythmically against the warm stones. Quack, 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 they murmured softly to one another, discussing the beautiful weather. When the ducks reached the stone wall, they stopped in their tracks. Their bright, curious eyes had spotted the colourful pile of clothes left behind by the kittens. Mr. Drake Duck stepped forward, tilted his head to one side, and looked at the blue woolen tunic with great interest. Moppet, who was watching from behind a large fern, stepped out and gave a polite little curtsy. "Good afternoon, dear ducks," she said. "Would you be so kind as to help us? We have managed to lose our clothes, and we cannot seem to put them back on properly." Mr. Drake Duck smiled a wide, duckish smile. "Quack! It would be an honour to assist you," he replied politely. He waddled over to the wall, but instead of handing the clothes back, he picked up Tom's tight blue tunic in his yellow beak. With a grand flourish, he managed to slip his own large wings through the armholes. The tunic was an incredibly tight fit for a duck, making his white feathers puff out in the most ridiculous way. But Mr. Drake Duck looked immensely proud of himself. Mrs. Rebecca Puddle Duck and her sister looked at the remaining clothes and decided they wanted to join in the fun too. Rebecca picked up the neat white pinafore and managed to tie it around her neck, while her sister took the small hat and placed it carefully between her ears. The 3 ducks looked absolutely absurd, dressed in the finest Sunday clothes of 3 little kittens, but they were utterly delighted. "Quack, quack! We look exceedingly grand today," Mr. Drake Duck announced. And with that, the 3 ducks turned around and continued their march down the path towards the high road, waddling and splashing happily. Tom Kitten, Moppet and Mittens stood on top of the wall and watched them go, their little tails twitching with amusement. Tom, looking slender and handsome in his natural curly brown fur, felt a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Without the tight, itchy clothes, he could climb, jump, and run as fast as he wanted. The 3 kittens began to play a merry game of tag, leaping over the marigolds through the warm summer air, completely forgetting about the afternoon tea. Meanwhile, back inside the cosy cottage, the grandfather clock gave another loud, deep chime. It was exactly 4 o'clock. Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit had just finished baking her last batch of sweet biscuits. The kitchen smelled wonderful, and the tea was brewing perfectly in the beautiful porcelain pot. She smoothed down her clean apron and opened the garden door to call her beautifully dressed children inside. "Moppet! Mittens! Tom!" she called out cheerfully. But when she stepped out onto the gravel path, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her jaw dropped, and her eyes went wide with complete dismay. There, right in the middle of her beautiful flower beds, were her 3 kittens. They had absolutely no clothes on at all. Moppet's pinafore was gone, Mittens' frock was missing, and Tom Kitten was completely bare, his curly brown hair covered in tiny green leaves and bits of garden soil. They were happily rolling in the dirt, looking completely untidy and utterly content. "Oh, my goodness gracious me!" Mrs. Tabitha cried out, her voice trembling. "Where are your beautiful clothes?" "My guests are walking up the lane this very minute, and you look like wild little creatures." Mittens trotted forward on all 4 paws, looking up at her mother with wide, apologetic eyes. "Dear mother," she mewed softly, "the clothes were so tight and so warm. We put them on the stone wall, and 3 very polite ducks came by and took them. They are wearing them right now, marching down the high road." Mrs. Tabitha took a deep, trembling breath. She looked toward the garden gate and saw her 3 elegant friends turning into the lane, dressed in their finest shawls and bonnets. There was no time to wash the kittens again, and certainly no time to chase after 3 waddling ducks. Feeling quite overwhelmed, Mrs. Tabitha scooped up the 3 bare kittens in her arms, hurried back into the cottage, and carried them straight up the wooden stairs to the bedroom. "You must stay up here, my dear children," she said. "I cannot let my guests see you looking so untidy. Stay here quietly while I entertain my friends in the parlour." She closed the bedroom door gently and walked back down the stairs, her heart heavy with disappointment. She felt that her perfect afternoon tea party was completely ruined before it had even begun. Downstairs, the doorbell rang with a cheerful little jingle. Mrs. Tabitha opened the door and welcomed her friends inside. They sat down in the beautiful sunlit parlour, surrounded by the sweet scent of tea and warm shortbread. But Mrs. Tabitha could not relax. She sat very stiffly in her chair, her teacup trembling slightly in her paw, waiting for her friends to ask where the children were. "Dear Tabitha," Mrs. Ribby said kindly, taking a slow sip of her warm tea, "your home is as beautiful as always, and the biscuits are absolutely delicious. But where are your lovely children? We were so looking forward to seeing them." Mrs. Tabitha looked down at her lap, her ears flattening slightly with embarrassment. But as she looked around the room at the warm, smiling faces of her dearest friends, she realized something important. These were her friends, and they loved her for who she was, not because her house or her children were perfectly neat. With a gentle, honest smile, Mrs. Tabitha told them exactly what had happened. She described how the clothes were too tight, how the kittens had shed them in the garden, and how Mr. Drake Duck and Mrs. Rebecca Puddle Duck were currently marching down the high road, squeezed into blue tunics. For a moment, the parlour was completely silent. Then Mrs. Ribby let out a soft chuckle. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with the warm, joyous sound of laughter. "Oh, Tabitha," Mrs. Ribby laughed gently. "Kittens will be kittens. They belong in the sunshine and the grass, not inside tight woolen suits. We came here to see you and to share a warm cup of tea, not to look at perfect outfits." Mrs. Tabitha felt a wonderful, soothing wave of relief wash over her. The tension left her shoulders, and she laughed along with her friends. Up in the bedroom, the 3 kittens heard the happy laughter coming from downstairs. They curled up together on the big, soft bed, feeling safe, warm, and deeply loved. They knew that even though they had made a mess, everything was completely all right. Outside, the sun began to dip below the green hills, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet garden. The ducks were happily splashing in the pond. The kittens were drifting off into a peaceful sleep, and the cottage was filled with warmth, friendship, and peace. The